One area in Vue that a lot of people have trouble with is the wind animation. And the reason for this is the previews that we have just within the atmosphere editor. If we go ahead and open up our atmosphere editor and take a look at the wind options, we have this small OpenGL plant that is kind of giving us a wind preview. But overall, if we want to see the effects of wind on an ecosystem, it can take a long time to render with full quality. So there's some settings we can use to speed up that render to give us some really good plant previews for our wind options. If we open up the render options window, under preset render quality, we can see we have an OpenGL setting that we have. As opposed to using the final and ultra user settings, and OpenGL is going to be a little bit separate and different. And basically what it's going to do is render what we see within our OpenGL preview in the main camera view. I'm just going to set this to final right now, render to screen. Let's go ahead and change this to a 16 by 9. We'll just render it at 640 by 360 for right now. And this way we can just get some quick renders of what the scene's going to look like. But we first need to set up some plants to animate and have affected by our wind, and then we can start taking a look at our preview options. So first I'm going to create just a standard terrain. So if we go over to the left and right mouse click on our terrain icon, we can select the first icon without the F, which symbolizes the function. And this way we just have a standard terrain. And I'm going to go ahead and just scale this up a bit. And then on the Z-axis, I'm going to select our gizmo for scale, because we have move, rotate, and scale. And whether or not we're using the local or global coordinates doesn't really matter. We'll just go ahead and scale that down on the Z. And we just want a surface that we can use to create a little bit of an ecosystem, add some plants to it, just to have a nice preview of a scene and something a little more realistic what we'd be working with. We're going to open up the material for this and select Type, Ecosystem, which is going to add in our ecosystem layer. If we go to General, we can select Add, and I'm going to select Plant. And now under our different plants, I'm going to select Trees. And I'm just going to use our rural maple tree. And we just want to get an idea of size, so I'm just going to hit populate. And we can take a look at the size of our instances. And it looks like that scale should be good for an overall ecosystem. I'm going to increase our density. And we can populate. But we don't really have any patches available. Any clearings between our trees. So I'm going to check on variable density. Right mouse click, go to edit function, and we're just going to set up a little bit of a variable density for this ecosystem. You can see that our output node is showing up as bump, but this is actually the density for this ecosystem. And what I want to do is just add in a noise node, and I'm going to stick with our default value. Click OK. Hit populate, and now we can see a little bit of a clearing in some of those areas, and if we need to, we can manipulate that noise node. If we go ahead and zoom out, get a better look at the overall terrain, we can tell that I will need to either add a filter or increase the size of this. I'm going to change our wavelength to 2 instead of 1 all the way across. And then we want to make sure we hit populate. And we're still not seeing very large clearings. So partially that could be because of the origin point of our material. What I could do is just increase some of these values. I'll do the X to 50 and the Y to 25. Populate. And we can see the material has moved, but because the density is so high, it's filling in a lot of those gray areas. So we'll go back to our function, select our blue connection line between our noise node and our output node, which is now showing up correctly as density. I'm going to add in a filter, and what we can use is the bias. And if we turn that down, it'll give us a little bit of a better contrast. As you can see, the differences between the two surfaces. And if I go up to the top left button, go to our preview options, and change this to 2D plane, we can see that a little bit better. Select our connecting line again. We're going to add another filter node, and now we could keep that with the bias of the same settings because we had our filter selected from before. So now we're creating another filter, and it's just going to give us the exact same filter we had before, which is really great for duplicates. But I do want to change this to our brightness and contrast, and now we can increase our contrast, lower our brightness just a little, and that way we have a very definite line dividing the areas of our terrain, and we can see that a little bit better. And now because of that, I am going to go back to our noise node and just bring that scale back down to 1 because we have those filters. And now you can see the large patches that are showing up in there. So I might need to decrease our contrast a little, populate, and fill in some of those areas. And now we have a pretty nice looking ecosystem with a little bit of variation and something we can work with that's a little more realistic for a real scene. If we need to, we could change the preview quality of our plants, and if we go to the General tab within the Material Editor, with that ecosystem layer selected, I can turn on full quality in your camera, and it looks like at the moment that is not showing up. If we increase our radius, we'll be able to start to see all of those instances, but I'm going to go ahead and turn off full quality in your camera and just change that to smooth shaded. And now we can see all of our trees in pretty much full quality. Although the response time, because of the amount of polygons we're seeing, might be slowed down. So whether or not you actually want to use this setting, it's really up to you. And I also have, for my video card, the anti-aliasing settings turned up to about 32 times. And of course, texture filtering is also up to about 16 times. So that is going to make our scene very high quality preview, but of course the response time for moving around the camera and updating could of course be slowed down. So whether or not you need to actually see all of your instances at this point is really up to you and dependent on your system. If we go down to the lower right and change this to the polygon count, we can see that we have 13 million polygons in the scene, and actually just about 14 million. So it can be kind of difficult to show those in full OpenGL view. We can go back and change that maybe to the flat shaded and have a little bit of a better response. But overall that's still going to slow us down a little. So we'll change that back to billboard. Use the full quality in your camera just so we can get an idea of some of the instances, but not exactly all of them. And now we have a little bit of a better response when manipulating the camera. I also want to go ahead and just change our terrain and the underlying material. So basically the terrain itself and not the ecosystem. What we do is load in another material for this, one of the presets. We could just double click, and then we could load in one of our landscapes. We could use the vegetation. We can go to material layers, and I'm going to select the large scale grass. Now this is asking us about the alpha information, and that's because we have multiple layers. But in this case, we should be okay whether or not we click yes or no, because we don't really have any other transparent surfaces. And I'm just going to click yes to ignore the alpha information. And everything looks to be showing up correctly. If we take a look at the preview, we can see we have a very dark scene. So what I want to do is go to our atmosphere editor and just modify some of our light settings. And the reason it's looking so dark is because our default sky is more close to a sunrise and really doesn't have a lot of ambient light. So under the light tab, I'm going to bring this down a little more to ambient, go to our sun, and just bring that pitch up a bit to make it a little more midday. And now this is more just for the visual appearance of the final scene and not so much the previews that we're working on. But I just want something I can set up where we can clearly see the differences between our render qualities and have a scene that's something a little more realistic instead of just a little test scene. And now if I wanted to, I could add another terrain behind this, but really this should be okay to take a look at our wind options. Now typically if I wanted to create an animation and really take a look and see how that wind is affecting these plants, we would go ahead and render, and I'm just going to render now with that final preset setting that we have. And this is rendering fairly quickly for what we have, about 10 seconds per frame. But that can take a little while if we have a long animation and we just want a really quick preview of what it is and how our plants are being affected. So let's go ahead and switch these OpenGL previews and our render quality. And we're going to go up to the render options, right mouse click on the camera to open that up. Switch this to OpenGL, and now we also have an edit option next to this. If I click edit, we have a quality boost. Now by default that quality boost is probably going to be around 0 or none. I'm going to click OK, and we'll take a look at that render. We can see that rendered in less than a second. So we have a good idea of our scene by looking at this now. It also looks like the preview we had before with the full OpenGL quality, with not just having the full quality in our camera on, where we can see all of our plants in the background. But also keep in mind, we do have a little bit of a reduction in our texture quality for some of our plants, and really only the ones close up are showing up correctly. But that renders much faster, but still the anti-aliasing on that, we'll go ahead and render that again. We can see it's a little jagged on the edges, so what we can do is go back to that quality boost, crank that all the way up to 4, and I'm actually going to go back into the render options and increase our frame size 1024 by 576, and click render, and it's still rendering in under a second or 1 second. We can see now those jagged lines are really reduced, and with the higher frame size and quality we can also see a lot more of the plants and their leaf options showing up in the back of our scene. So we can use this method to render out our animation, and since it renders so quickly, and we can still see, even though we don't have the full quality plant and material, we can see all the clip maps and a good idea of all the different trunks on our trees and get a good idea of our wind animation. Well, first what we need to do is set up a little bit of animation, because even though we have that automatic wind in our atmosphere, if we go ahead and open that up, we can see that is turned on. We don't have any designated frames in our scene. So therefore, if we tried to render an animation, we wouldn't really see anything because there's no keyframe set. So what I'm going to do is hit F11 on the keyboard, which is going to pull up our timeline. And I'm just going to drag our slider to about 4 seconds. And we can type that in manually if needed. And now what we can do is right mouse click on this button that we have right here. But first we need to select what we want to become animated. I'm just going to select our terrain because it's not going to be moving right mouse click, and go to Add Position Keyframe. And this is just going to set up a keyframe for animation and set the animation. It's not physically moving anything in the scene. If we did want to move the position of this, we could, but we really don't need to. And basically we just want to tell View that we want a 4-second animation, and we can see that timeline showing up even though we don't actually have any movement of the object itself, just the ecosystem that's showing up in our scene. Now, for a really fast preview, if we don't want to render out and go through and take the time to set up all of our animation options for a frame output, have to encode that into a correct video format, even though that goes pretty quick, we can still get a very fast preview within View itself. And if we take a look at this little film canister, little film in the lower right here of the timeline, I can go ahead and right mouse click on this to open up our animation preview options. Now we have the same settings that we have within our regular render options, where we can set it to OpenGL, Final, Preview, Broadcast, Ultra, or the user settings if you have set up everything the way that you want it and you have your own settings you like to use, which is usually a good idea. And we have our preview size. Now for this preview size, the 4 times is definitely what we'd want to be using if we have this set to OpenGL, because it is rendering so quickly. Same thing with our preview frame rate. Right now it's set to 10 frames. I'm going to go ahead and boost this up to 30 frames per second and just click OK. And it's automatically going to render out our preview, which we can see. And if we also take a look at this preview, because of the size, we're running into that problem again with our plants in the back and those leaves not really showing up correctly. And that's because of the OpenGL and the fact that a lot of those pixels really won't be visible until you have a larger frame. But we'll just go ahead and let this finish out rendering. We can get a good idea of our plant animation just for this 4 seconds. And then we can render out a larger preview and a larger animation to get an even better idea of what this ecosystem is going to look like. So now our preview has finished rendering, and we can take a look and just play it on the bottom. Now because I'm recording the screen as I'm doing this, you're not going to really see this in full animation, and it's not going to be very fluid, but we can go through and kind of scrub through the animation. But of course, because the frame size is so small, it can be difficult to really see the plants, and that's the only drawback of this small preview. One of the nice things is, though, if we're rendering the larger frames, it will actually take about the same time to render a larger animation preview as it will this smaller one with the OpenGL settings, because really, if you look at how quickly the OpenGL refreshes in our actual scene while we're previewing it, you can get a better idea of how that renderer works. So let's take a look at setting up a little bit of a larger animation. So we're going to go to the animation render options. We have this set to 30 frames per second. That OpenGL is set because it's taking our settings from our render options from before. We can set this up to render which frames we want. Render entire animation, which we have our animation set to 4 frames, 120 frames, or sorry, 4 seconds, so 120 frames. Or we can go in there to the render sequence and set up the exact amount of frames. So if we just want to render 3 seconds, we can render 90 frames. And we can also set it up by start time and end time, so 3 seconds or 4 seconds, and basically however much you want. Another thing you can do is set your frame increment maybe to 2, and then render with a little bit of a higher frame rate, and then maybe play that back at a different frame rate if you're just going to be saving out individual frames, and that will give you a little bit of a quicker preview. We'll take a look at that in just a minute, and actually just use Photoshop Extended in order to view that animation with individual frames. And mainly that's a good idea, because with a preview you don't need to have 30 frames per second. 15 will work just fine. So we could change that to 15, or we could set it to 30, up our frame increment to 2, and then when we play it back, we can set that to 15 frames, or we could go twice as fast with 30 frames. And what we just want to do is set up our options for this and our animation. We can go to our format options, and right now we have it set up as a video file. And that's based on our browse. So we want to set up a folder that we want to save this in. And after clicking browse, we can select the folder we want to put it in, give it a name, and I'm just going to call this Test Wind Eco. And now our type is the animation that we're going to be saving. If we want to save it as an actual movie file and have it compressed, we can select a couple of different formats. AVI can work best, but what we can also use is MPEG videos, which will also give us a really good preview of what we're looking at. Or we can go in and save individual frames. And now, in order to use individual frames, we just want to make sure that we're using one of the image formats, either JPEG, bitmap. For a preview like this, JPEG is going to work best because it's very small file sizes, and even though JPEGs are highly compressed, and for a final output they might look terrible, just for these previews, you really want kind of a low file size, because with a bitmap at basically full quality, it's going to take up a lot of space, hard drive space, and the response time of playing the animation is not going to be great. So we'll save that as a JPEG, and then we can save our quality setting. Just the default of 70% should be fine. And that looks like it's all ready to go. If you want to set up an alpha, you can also just check the alpha on, and you can also do the depth Z buffer as well. But this looks like it should be good, so we're just going to go ahead and render out this animation, and then we can take a look at the full quality preview and then figure out what we need to do to adjust our wind settings in order to make it look better. And now I just have Photoshop CS3 Extended open, and we're going to use this to preview the animation because we saved it out as frames. And I'm going to go to File, Open, and we're just going to select one of our frames from the animation, select an image sequence, and then click Open. And now we can set our frame rate to 15 frames per second, since we used that 2-frame increment. And this is basically going to give us a preview of the length of the animation at 15 frames per second, as opposed to 30 frames. Now we can see the sequence has gaps. Now the reason for that is because we did that frame increment, so that can sometimes be a problem. Whether or not you want to use the Adobe Bridge to fix that and change all your frames is really up to you. So what I'm going to do is hit cancel, just because in this case we go back to File, Open. When we save that frame increment, it doesn't save out the correct numbers, where we have 001 and then 2, 3, 4 and so on. It's rendering 2, 4, 6, 8, and those names are going to throw off Photoshop. If you're using Photoshop, one thing you can do to really quickly change those frames is use the Adobe Bridge. So we can go to File and Browse to open that up. And now with our folder selected in our bridge, we can go up to Tools, Batch Rename, and just rename them in the same folder. What we want to do is set up the text, which can be the same as it was before, Test Wind Eco. And then for the other two options of text, we could just change these to the sequence number, but since we already have sequence number on the bottom, we can just set that to what it's already at. Start with a sequence number of 1, and then we can set the amount of digits. If we bring it up to 6, we're basically going to have what we had before. Click rename, and now everything is going to be named correctly, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's just going to work better for Photoshop. Now, we could also get the same result just by saving as a 15 frame per second animation, but sometimes switching between a 30 frame and a 15 frame, if you have a lot of keyframes set up, can really kind of throw things off. Even though View does tend to compensate and add the frames correctly, it's still sometimes a good idea just to go ahead and use this tool if you have it available to change that. But otherwise, we can go back into View and I can show you how to set up those options if you're not going to be using that. So we can go ahead and close out the bridge, File, Open, select our image sequence of our frame, 15 frames, click OK, and now there's no gaps. And we want to open up just our animation toolbar and go to Window, Animation. We can see this on the bottom with our 4 seconds. And the first thing we need to do, and one thing to keep in mind about Photoshop for previewing your animation, is it's going to render to your RAM. So if you don't have a lot of RAM on your system or memory, you may not be able to play the animation in full, and maybe only sections of it. So first you need to click play, which will render it to your RAM, and it won't play back at the correct speed depending on what format you're using. But now we can see the animation of our leaves and all of our trees moving around and get a better idea of what our wind settings are doing to our different trees. Now we can see we have some weird things going on. Whether or not you can see with compression of the overall tutorial, that preview quality, I'll go ahead and save out an animation on the CD-ROM so you can see and get a better idea for yourself of what this looks like. But we can see the tips of some of these trees are kind of blowing around a little weird. It might not look realistic. So what we can do is go back and change our wind options now and have a very quick way to make a preview and make those changes without having to take forever to render, and still have a really good idea of what the plants look like, and with a good size preview as well. So we can go ahead and stop that. And now if you don't have an image sequence viewer available, we're going to go ahead and take a look at another way to render this out as a movie directly, so you don't have to use a program like Photoshop. Go ahead and close that out. Go back into View, go to Animation, Animation Render Options, set our frame increment back down to 1, and if we want to render that 15 frames per second, we can just go ahead and change that. If I click OK, we can see that we still have that 4-second animation, but now there's only 15 frames for each second. In this case, it's working correctly for our timeline, but if you have keyframes set to specific frames, this can throw it off, because of course there are more frames available at 30 frames, and switching back and forth can sometimes throw you off, which is why I had that frame increment before. But let's take a look at saving this to a different format, and if we hit Browse, we can select our folder. I'm going to call this 10 Test Wind Eco Vid, and then our animation file we're going to select as an AVI and click Save. And now it's going to bring up our compressor options, which is the same that we'll see when we click on Format Options within Animation Render Options. And now we just have a couple of different compressors to choose from in here. Microsoft Video 1 will work well. If you're on a Mac, you'll also have different settings you can use to save this out, and an AVI might not be available. So basically you just have to use whichever compressor setting is really going to work best on your Mac. The default settings for this usually work really well. If you need to keep that file size down, when you go to Configure, you can bring down your quality ratio, but I'm going to keep it at 0.75. Click OK, and now we can go ahead and render out this animation, which is going to save this time as video. And now we can see our finished video. I'm going to right mouse click and go to just add to now playing list, so it opens up within Windows Media Player. And if we take a look at the compression settings, we can tell the quality of this is not fantastic, but it's still a good idea of what the scene looks like and the overall plant animation. And I'll of course save this onto the disk so you can take a look at the overall quality. But once again, it's just a preview of our plants and really gives us just a good idea and a nice previs of our scene. We'll go ahead and close that out. And now if we wanted a little bit of a better render preview of our scene, and we don't want to use the OpenGL, there are still ways to speed up that render to give us a little bit of a quicker overall animation and a good preview still. And what we can do is just turn off some of our settings. So let's take a look at ways we can improve our render speed just for these previews. If we go to our light options, what I want to do is change this to standard. Standard is going to render way faster than using global ambience or ambient occlusion, and especially radiosity or global illumination, because of course then you have your indirect lighting on your plants. And really for right now, we just need a preview, but basically we just want a way to render now without that OpenGL so we can see the textures, but still have it very quick and not have to worry about those render times. So once we switch that to the standard lighting mode, what we could also do is change this to the volumetric or standard model. The spectral model for our atmosphere is going to increase render times by quite a bit. And what we'll need to do is just decrease our fog settings, maybe get rid of our haze, because we just want to match kind of the way it looked before with the spectral model. And a good idea too is to save out the atmosphere you have before you change these settings, and that way you can go back to your scene when you're done rendering, when you want to render out that final animation, so you don't have to worry about losing all of those settings you had. But this is going to render much quicker now. If we go to our render options, I'm going to go to our user settings, and we can turn off a lot of these different settings that we have available that are going to slow down our render. Right now, with just these user settings, I'm going to go ahead and click render, and we're going to take a look at the time it takes to render this out. Now we can see that this frame took 28 seconds to render. Now really that's not very practical for a preview scenario. So we are going to turn down some of the settings. But first let's take a look at our post-render options. And what we could do for this is to change some of these post-processing settings in order to make it look like we have global illumination on, and kind of make it look like that final frame. And really with the plant previews it's not a big deal, but for regular previs this can be very helpful. And what we can use is our gain settings and density. We can adjust our brightness just to kind of get that global illumination look by using very, very low quality settings, and then apply this directly to our frames. So we're just using the gain and the density and the brightness just to kind of match what we had before. We can also adjust our gamma correction and use that as well, and just kind of tweak this until we get the kind of look we had before with the higher quality render settings. Click OK to apply that. Now we have a very high contrast image. Some of the shadowed areas are showing up a little bit better. And if you need to make adjustments, of course, you can always go back and change those post-processing settings. But let's take a look at speeding up the render for our animation, but still being able to see our textures. So we'll right mouse click on our render options, and we're still using those user settings. Now what I can do is turn off subrays. So if you don't need to see your shadows or any reflections or transparency, you can turn off enable subrays, and that way you won't have any shadows in your scene, which is definitely going to speed up your render. We'll go ahead and render that out. And just by turning off those shadows, we cut 2 seconds off of the frame. But if you really need to see the shadows, then you can just turn that back on. Mainly, a lot of that render time is coming in with the anti-aliasing options. If you don't really need anti-aliasing on, you can just go ahead and turn that off for object and texture, and also take your advanced effects quality and turn that down. So let's go ahead and render that. And this is going to render much quicker now than what we had before. So now we have shadows turned on, and this rendered in 9 seconds. So it's definitely not as quick as the OpenGL, which is basically 1 second or under a second. But now we can see our textures on our scene and see a little bit more of what it's going to look like and have a good previs. Now since we have a 9 seconds, and depending on the length of the animation, you might want to have a little bit of anti-aliasing. So let's just take a look at some of the settings to still increase our render speed, and maybe add 1 or 2 seconds onto the time just to increase that quality. Go back to our render options. We're going to go to turn back on our anti-aliasing for object and texture. And now we have our subray per pixel settings and our quality thresholds. And these are basically what is taking those extra seconds to render each frame. What I can do is turn these down to 2, and typically even a setting of 3 is far too low for a final output. Take our quality threshold and just go ahead and turn that down to 20% and render another frame. And now we can see it is rendering with the anti-aliased objects, and not as quick as it was before, but still much quicker than a final output would be. And let's just take a look at our render time, which is 17 seconds. So really we only added about 5 seconds to that render time, maybe a little bit more, give or take, depending on the frame. But it's still something that works really well for previs. We could even turn off our texture anti-aliasing, render that again, so we just have the edges of the objects being anti-aliased. And this will speed up our render time a lot more. We'll go ahead and take a look. And now we're down to 13 seconds, which isn't bad at all. And what we could even do is have a little bit of motion blur, depending on the scene. Of course, with the amount of passes we have with the anti-aliasing, a motion blur might not show up too much. But we're going to double click on the main camera, and we can see our blur length. And I'm going to go ahead and increase that to 100%. And there's not a lot of motion in our scene because of how slowly the plants are moving. But I'm going to go ahead and scrub into the animation a little bit. And we're going to render out another frame. And since our anti-aliasing is really only 2 passes, we're not going to see the motion blur that much, but it could help, which is that overall quality. And that rendered in 14 seconds. And now, because we are partially into our animation and our post-render options are up, it's asking us if we'd like to animate these post-render options. Well, I'm going to click No. We can close that out, go back to our render settings, and we could modify even more of these options. We have our advanced effects quality, and this allows us to adjust a little bit more of our settings. What we can do is go to custom settings, and we can speed up our render times a little bit more for just these previews. We can change our sampling and just pull that down. Got it set to 64, And we'll go ahead and bring down these other values to around 25% for our adaptive sampling. And you want to make sure that for these previews you do have adaptive sampling on, because what this does is only renders for each anti-aliasing pass the parts of the scene that are moving, and if it's not moving, it's just going to use that first pass and not go over it again. And our bucket size we want to make sure is on the largest, which is 16 by 16. As we start to reduce this, it's going to increase quality, and that's really not what we're worried about right now. So we can go ahead and render another frame, and then just take a look at the time it takes once again to complete this, so we can get a good idea of how long it'll take to make a preview. And we have 13 seconds now, so it did take a second off. And the more we reduce those settings, the quicker this is going to render out. If we remove our shadows, that'll improve it a little bit more. And of course we can always reduce the size of our frame. So if you don't need the frame size to be this big to get a good idea of how the plants are moving or the textures, you can always reduce that, because now we don't need to worry about the size because we're not using the OpenGL in order to show up all of our different textures. So I can go ahead and reduce the size to 640 by 360 and render that out, which is going to greatly increase our render time, or decrease our render time. And now it rendered in 5 seconds. And this is still a good frame size to tell for previs how our plants are going to be moving. So let's just go back into our atmosphere editor, go to our wind settings, and now we can select whether or not we want wind on a per plant basis, whether or not we want the breeze on. If we turn both of these off, our wind is off completely. We're going to have nothing affecting our plants. So now we can go in and adjust all of our different wind settings. It's a good idea to do this at frame 0 so that we don't keep having that pop-up asking if we want to animate these options. And we can adjust all of our settings, keep rendering out these really quick previews until we get the scene that looks correct and looks the way we want it to. And this is also a great way to preview ventilators in our scene. So if we wanted to add either a directional or omni ventilator, go ahead and add one of those in. We can check to influence our ecosystem instances so they're blowing those around and not just individually placed plants. And that way we have a much better preview of our ventilators as well. So it's really quite versatile for any sort of previs, and not just for the ecosystems. Let's go ahead and just remove this terrain from our scene, and we can take a look at just another really quick scene. I'm going to go ahead and add in just a fractal terrain, or one that we have controlled with a function, a procedural terrain. And we can right mouse click, go to edit object. I'm going to turn off zero edges, and I also am going to scale down our terrain editor window so we can see this a little bit better. Go to our procedural tab and just kind of scale this down a bit. And we just want to create some valleys for our overall scene here. Click OK. And now if we take a look, these might be a little too high. I'm going to scale this down on the Z. And it's very washed out right now because of the settings we had before to display our plants. So what we want to do is just change our terrain material, and we can set this to large scale rock number 2 from material layers. Ignore our alpha information, and then we're going to go back to our main camera post-processing. So we'll double click on the main camera, turn off post-processing, and now we can see what the scene looks like without that on. Maybe go to our atmosphere editor and turn off the haze. Go to our lighting, change it to a little more towards sunlight, and get some of those shadows in there, and pull down the pitch of our sun. We're just going to create a little quick animation. Go ahead and just reposition our camera. And now I'm going to go ahead and actually go back to frame 0 and open up our properties to take a look. And we just want to make sure that this animated option we had before, which was actually for our other terrain, it's still showing up. But we'll be able to overwrite that. And we'll just drag in here, and I'm going to make a 6-second animation. Go to our procedural terrain, or actually our main camera, and we'll just create a little bit of motion for that. We can close out all of these different windows and also our preview. And we just want to move our camera through the scene. Just creating a little bit of an animation that we can scrub through. And now if this preview isn't good enough, just the OpenGL preview, what we can do is use those same settings to kind of render this out. And if I go ahead and just render a frame right now, we can see it's rendering very quickly and giving us a good idea of our procedural terrain. It rendered in 5 seconds. And then we can also use that OpenGL once again to render these out very quickly. But of course, with the procedural terrain, it's not going to show up at the highest quality with the OpenGL preview. And we're not going to see the texture, and what it's going to show us is basically the overall color of our terrain and its material, which right now is kind of a brownish tan color. So we can switch back and forth between these settings to render previews for our regular scenes. And if we want, we could add a little bit of an ecosystem to that procedural terrain. Add a plant. We'll just use maple trees again. Populate that, go to our environment tab, and just make it populate on the higher altitudes. Go ahead and render that out. And it's still very quick, and it'll work really, really well for a previs. Now if I had water in the scene, there's some different settings we can use to improve that render quality of that. So we'll go ahead and add in water and an infinite plane. Change this to our move gizmo, and I'm just going to pull this up so we can see it. And now if I go ahead and render this, we can see we don't have reflection on, so it's still rendered in 5 frames, and we can see where the water is showing up. So it's a really good preview. But let's say we need a preview of those reflections. We can go to our render options, and that's because under subrays we have traced reflections turned off. So if we turn that back on and click render, we're still seeing that is not showing up correctly. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Some of it could have to do with our advanced effects quality being the settings that they are, and our different trace levels. So we'll go ahead and turn some of those settings off. And we're still ending up with about the same look here for our water. So that might be a little bit of an error right now. because trace reflections is turned on. So it could just be one of our other settings kind of interfering with that. Because we were switching back and forth and didn't really clear out the scene before we were doing these things. But it's just another way you could turn off the reflections or turn them on depending on the type of preview that you need for your scene. So we could go ahead, and I'm just going to render out a quick preview of this, and we could take a look. So I'm going to go to our animation render options and just set up a 15 frame per second animation and just render this out, and then we can take a look. And now our preview is finished, and we can just take a look and get a nice idea of what the scene is going to look like. And this rendered out very quickly, and it's a really great previs for anything you're working on within Vue. And of course this file will be saved out on the CD as well, so you can take a look at the overall quality.